All the Kraken really have to do to be better than the Golden Knights in their first season is to win the Stanley Cup, or at least 2 games in the final series anyway. I mean, how hard could that really be? With the Seattle Kraken expansion draft now less than a month away, all eyes in the NHL, at least outside of the 4 teams who are still in the playoffs anyway, are slowly starting to shift to the Kraken and that expansion draft. And of course, with the rules being pretty much exactly the same as they were for Vegas 4 years ago, the temptation is gonna be there to compare whatever Seattle does in their first couple of seasons to what Vegas was able to do. And so with that being the case, I figured we'd take a look 4 years back into the past at Vegas's expansion draft and see how they became the team that has now gone to the conference finals in 3 of their first 4 years, and after having gone to the Stanley Cup finals in their first season, has a chance to do it again this year as they are currently playing for a chance to go there. But before we get too deep into Vegas and their expansion draft, I do want to take a minute to mention the fact that while on the surface these 2 expansion drafts, Vegas's and Seattle's, look pretty much the same with almost exactly the same rule sets between the 2, the situations surrounding them could not be more different. For one, as we're about to see, Vegas largely built their way to success through the trades that they made during the expansion draft, as much as the guys that they got in the expansion draft itself, which is definitely something that most of the GMs have now had 4 years to learn from and try to prevent doing when it comes to Seattle coming up here in a month. On top of that, while Seattle, like Vegas, will be taking 1 player from each of the other 30 teams in the NHL, the thing that Seattle also has to contend with that Vegas didn't is that 31st team in the Golden Knights themselves now being around to potentially mess with some of those potential trade scenarios that Seattle could take advantage of, considering Vegas doesn't have to worry about protecting or exposing players. Now, as the Golden Knights are already one of the teams that are up against next year's salary cap, I'm not exactly sure how much that last thing will end up coming into play, but regardless, that's even before we mention all of the changes that have happened over the last couple of seasons, thanks to the pandemic. When Vegas entered the league back in 2017, they were joining an NHL that was pretty much running business as usual, coming off of back-to-back 82-game seasons, and with a salary cap that was going up every year. But now, after a pandemic, Seattle is coming into a league that has seen back-to-back shortened seasons and a salary cap that has not expanded in the last 2 years and is again not likely to go up for another few after it. And with that being the case, a number of teams are already right up against the salary cap for next season even before starting to re-sign players. So there will be a number of teams looking to Seattle and let's just say their enviable amount of cap space to help them out with some of those contracts that have particularly not aged well. So now, even with GMs having had some time to learn from Vegas and what they were able to do with trades in their expansion draft, some of those trades may now be back on the table as teams look for salary cap help before worrying too much about how that could benefit the Kraken. But even with all of that and the fact that this year's free agency is going to be a particularly wild one with the large number of unrestricted free agents that are about to hit that market that again is going to be affected by that flat salary cap, the comparisons are still going to be there between Vegas and Seattle's expansion drafts. So let's get into what Vegas was able to do in theirs. Now, as myself, among many others, have started to do mock Seattle Kraken expansion drafts, by the time the expansion draft itself comes and goes, it could very well be the case, in fact I'd probably even be surprised if it wasn't, that after the fact people are going to look at this team's roster and think, how is this team even going to win games, much less make the playoffs and have a chance to do what Vegas did in their first season? Well, the fact of the matter is that after Vegas's expansion draft, a lot of people had those same thoughts as the team really didn't look all that great on paper, especially on the forward end, and that isn't super likely to change when it comes to the Kraken. But again, with the Kraken, just like the Golden Knights before them, it's very likely that this team's final roster in their first season will not be fully built off of, and maybe not even majority built off of the players that they actually select in the expansion draft. I mean, just looking at the players that Vegas took in their expansion draft, 11 of those guys never even played a single game for the Golden Knights. And a 12th in Brendan Leipsic, who they got from the Maple Leafs, was traded midway through that first season. Beyond that, another 5 of them wouldn't see the end of a second season in Vegas, and only 6 of the players taken in that expansion draft are still on the Golden Knights roster right now. And even with all of those differences that we mentioned, among others that these two expansion drafts will have, that amount of turnover probably should be somewhat similar and expected when it comes to the Kraken and their expansion draft. So it does get harder and harder to compare these two teams the longer you get into their existence. So we're especially going to focus on that first season, as that is what's coming up for the Kraken. In their first season, in case you don't remember, Vegas defied all expectations even in the regular season, going 51-24-7 with 109 points and winning the Pacific Division. So that wasn't just that they did well in the playoffs, they also had a pretty good regular season as well. But of course, they did also carry that on into the postseason, where they would end up going all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals before eventually falling to Ovechkin and the Capitals in 5 games. But as you might expect with them having been an expansion team, they did all of that without necessarily having much when it comes to, say, superstar level players. Instead, they did it in a much different way than most teams do, especially considering their leading scorer, William Karlsson, finished the season 23rd in the NHL in points. Now, even after I just got done talking about how the guys that will be picked in the expansion draft aren't necessarily going to be the entirety of an expansion team's core for the Kraken, when you take a look at the Golden Knights, they did still make a pretty big difference in that team's first season, or at least a few of them did anyway. Because as we look at that 2017-18 Golden Knights team specifically, 7 of their top 10 points producers were guys that did come in the expansion draft. And obviously, points production isn't the only way of measuring how much a certain guy contributes to a team. There are plenty of stats and different opinions on how you to measure that, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll also look at amount of time spent on ice, where, goalies aside, again, 8 of the top 10 guys in ice time for the Golden Knights that season all came in the expansion draft. But going back to those points producers for just a second, this is where we start to see another key aspect of what made the Golden Knights successful out of the gate, and something that the Kraken are also going to have to find if they want to also find success in their first season. And that is finding players that are going to perform well above what they have done up to this point in their career. As the Golden Knights were able to collect a number of guys that had career years their first year in Vegas. And nobody is a better example of this than the top guy on that list in William Karlsson, who was Vegas's pick from the Columbus Blue Jackets, and there's a little bit more to that particular selection, but we'll get there in just a second. At the time of the draft, Karlsson was 24 years old and being paid $1 million per year, and was coming off of a couple of seasons for the Blue Jackets where he had scored 20 and 25 points respectively, each in 81-game seasons, so definitely not the points producer that they were kind of hoping he would be for them. But then, as soon as he got to Vegas, put up 43 goals in that first season and 78 points in 82 games, which, as you can probably tell, is a pretty significant improvement and easily the best season of his career. And potentially a large part of the reason for that sudden success in Vegas was the fact that he was also given quite a bit more of a role with the Golden Knights than he had been given a chance with the Blue Jackets, where he had only been right around 13 to 14 minutes of ice time per game in Columbus, but with Vegas was well above 18 minutes in every season so far to this point. Now, that first season in Vegas still remains his best one from a scoring standpoint, but even in this last 56-game season, he was still able to put up 39 points, which is still significantly more than he was doing in 81 games in Columbus. So he definitely has blossomed much more in Vegas than he had shown up to that point in his career before the draft. But while Karlsson may be the best and certainly most exaggerated example of this, he's far from the only one on that Golden Knights roster that saw a noticeable step up in their first year in Vegas from what they had done in previous seasons with their other teams. As Marchessault, Perron, and Haula, who are 3 of the other 4 in that top 5, all also saw noticeable steps up in their first season with the Golden Knights. And again, to step away from points production for just a second, the other guy, and maybe second best example other than Karlsson, of a guy that saw a bit of a rejuvenation to their career after joining the Golden Knights, would be their goaltender in Marc-Andre Fleury. And the thing that all 5 of these guys have in common is what brings us to what Vegas did incredibly well in this expansion draft. And that is that all 5 of those guys came over with some incentive from the teams that they were picked from to the Golden Knights. Starting with Fleury, who was 32 at the time of the draft, he came over from the Pittsburgh Penguins along with a second-round draft pick in order for the Penguins to get free of the last 2 years of his contract that was going to earn him just under $6 million per year. Of course, another part of this was that they were choosing to move forward with Matt Murray in goal, who had helped win them 2 Stanley Cups. But we've seen how that worked out for these two franchises. In exchange for taking Karlsson from Columbus, Vegas also got a first and second round pick, though they did also take on the rest of a pretty hefty contract of David Clarkson, who never played again in the NHL. So there was a little bit of give and take there, but that first round pick turned into Nick Suzuki, who was packaged with the second in order to get Max Pacioretty from Montreal. Meanwhile, with Haula from Minnesota, although Vegas did also give up a third in this trade, they also got Alec Tuck, and this was partially because Minnesota didn't want to lose guys like Matt Dumba, who is now one of the leading names that they could end up losing to the Kraken. Of course, Tuck has, as we've seen, turned into a key part of Vegas's core, and again was another one of those top 10 scorers in that first season. Meanwhile, in a similar type of deal, but one that is much more confusing as to why it was agreed upon by the other team that was participating, from Florida, Vegas selected Marchessault, but also got Riley Smith in exchange for a 4th round pick from the Panthers. Now, Marchessault was coming off of a pretty decent season and continued to play well for Vegas as their second leading points producer in their first season. Meanwhile, Riley Smith turned out to be Vegas's 4th leading points producer again in that first season, and both are still with the team. So again, it's pretty hard to figure out what Florida was thinking when they made this trade. Honestly, it seems like a Michael Scott level of management that made this trade happen, but maybe that's why Florida has a different general manager now than they did when Vegas was expanding. But of course, there's still one last guy on that top 10 points producers list in that first season that is yet to be accounted for, and also the same guy that was second in ice time for them in that first season amongst skaters, and that is Shea Theodore, who Vegas got from the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for taking on the Clayton Stoner contract, who again is another guy that never played another game in the NHL. Now, with Anaheim, it's not necessarily that the idea behind it was a bad one in trading a prospect so that an expansion team can take on the last few $1 million of a contract of a guy that's probably never going to play again, especially considering that Anaheim was still trying to compete at this point in time. The problem is that they clearly underestimated Shea Theodore, as he has turned into maybe Vegas's best player, or certainly one of their 3 best. Not to mention the fact that the Stoner contract was not all that debilitating of a contract for Vegas to take on, as he was only due $3.25 million for 1 more season. And those certainly weren't the only trades that Vegas did either. They're definitely the most notable, but there were a few other trades, as well as the fact that Vegas flipped 4 of the guys that they drafted in the expansion draft, mostly for draft picks. In the end, netting 14 extra draft picks that they didn't have when they started, including 2 first-rounders in their first entry draft, as well as picking up a number of players, including, as you've seen, a number of ones that contributed right away. So in the end, Vegas's success in their first season was driven by a combination of some of those guys that they did get in the expansion draft, as well as a few key players that they got via trade also from the expansion draft. Now, like any team over the last few years that have followed, they've had a certain amount of turnover year over year, but a large portion of their success in the last few seasons has been how active they've been in going after top free agents, which isn't necessarily something they did a whole lot of in their first season, picking up a handful of free agents, but mostly for veteran minimums, and none of whom, or at least not very many of whom, contributed a ton in that first season. And that's where I think one of the biggest differences is going to be between that expansion draft and the one that Seattle's about to go through. Now, I do think that a number of trades are probably still going to happen, largely because of the flat salary cap, because even though GMs are going to be a little bit more wary after what happened with Vegas about making trades with Seattle, the salary cap is going to force the hand of a number of GMs, so we'll see where that ends up going. But as long as Seattle can stay somewhat close to that minimum that they need to in the expansion draft, they can be pretty big players in what looks to be a pretty interesting free agent market coming up, which means they can do quite a bit more building there than Vegas did in their first season. Plus, for what it's worth on the trade front, While Vegas had the 6th overall pick coming into their expansion draft in the following entry draft, Seattle's now coming into their expansion draft with the 2nd overall pick, which they could potentially use as a trade chip, especially if they can get some more high round picks in exchange from other teams through the expansion draft. So that's another thing to keep your eye on. So what does this all really mean for Seattle and the upcoming expansion draft? Well, like it or not, the comparisons are gonna be there in the first season between Seattle and Vegas and what they were able to do in their first season. And although the rules between the expansion drafts are almost exactly the same, the situations the two teams are coming into are very different. But for Seattle, the opportunity to be a good team out of the gate is still very much there if they can take advantage of it. Of course, part of their ability to take advantage of it will be to find some diamonds in the rough like Vegas was able to do with Carlson and even Fleury to some extent, as well as a few other guys. But fortunately, it seems like that's something that Seattle might actually be set up pretty well to be able to handle, especially with one of the biggest and potentially best scouting departments when it comes to statistical analytics. So if that pans out, they should be able to find a few of those guys that haven't really been able to show what they have with their current situations and could in Seattle with an expanded role. It's still probably a little bit much to expect Seattle to be winning the Pacific right out of the gate or going to the Stanley Cup Finals, but again, this is a team that I think is set up to be pretty competitive right away, and as they're coming into a Pacific division that outside of Vegas doesn't look particularly strong, especially considering only one other team in the Oilers went to the playoffs this season, they also are coming into a division that should allow them to have a chance at making the postseason right away. And from there, well, if they turn out to be the defensive, physical team that they're likely to be, they might be able to make some noise in the playoffs, but we'll save that discussion for another time. For now, though, we'll call that the end of this one. So if you have made it to this point, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section on what you think the comparisons between Seattle and Vegas's expansion draft are and how fair those comparisons are going to be. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.